I'm now recording the lecture for COM 375 documentary filmmaking, and this lecture is about documentary truth. I can tell you that my experience in this topic is drawn from a lot of different sources. Years as a film student, multiple years. Decades as a producer, a television producer, a talk show producer, and then a lot of time diving into textbooks to think about and frame how I was going to present this notion to you guys. And the whole idea of documentary truth has been overturned in some fascinating ways in the digital media era. So I think it's fair to say that we as a society were more naive regarding truth and honesty than we are today. We're more cynical today because we've seen more examples of manipulation of visual truth. And so there was a time where if something was on camera or on a piece of film, that meant that it happened, right? That was supposedly a recording of a true event. And when I was in graduate school, that was just sort of understood that film captured life. Now, we knew, even when I was a film student, that there were places where life was faked for the cameras. And so as a student, I studied Nanook of the North with my professors, really just brilliant documentary film professors. And we had this conversation 20 plus years ago. I had this same conversation, but I was the student listening to this argument, and now I am on the other side of this argument. And I am just as cynical now as I was taught to be then. And so when you guys watch Nanook of the North, I'm sure some of you have because I've seen the engagement scores on that. I know some of you have watched it, at least watched parts of it. There are parts of that film that look obviously fake. And I would argue, and my professors that taught me would argue, that the audience that saw that in the 1920s and 30s did not recognize that it was fake. They didn't see that when Nanook pulls a whole fish out of the water, while the film camera is running, that it completely defies the logical financial constraints of filmmaking, right? So let's think about film as a medium as we build this criticism. Film, not video, not digital. Film was expensive, right? It was expensive to buy, and you had to cart it around in light-proof containers. Any light getting in would destroy the film and render it useless. So it had to be protected. The containers were heavy, the cameras were heavy. And then once it was shot with the camera, it had to be again put into a light-proof container, gotten to a development lab. The lab a few days later would give you back your film on a strip, on a film strip. So a huge, difficult process, right? It was not easy to shoot, to purchase, to pay for, to make film. It was a very labor-intensive, very expensive operation. The audience maybe is unaware of that problem and that process when they're watching that moment. We engage in something called the willing suspension of disbelief. And so we're not watching Nanook pulling that fish out of the water and thinking about Robert Flaherty, the filmmaker. We're watching and thinking about Nanook and his wife and his 2 kids, and will they eat that day, right? We are engaged in the narrative, and it's why we watch films. That's why we're there. We want to see this life or death situation. And so when Nanook pulls that fish out and it looks big and delicious and we know it's going straight to the barbecue, that's a triumphant moment in that film. Now, the reality of filmmaking. Are you telling us, Robert Flaherty, that you kept your very expensive film camera that's probably hand cranked unless you've run a 12-mile extension cord from some electrical socket out into the middle of the frozen tundra. So you were hand cranking while Nanook was fishing. Who's gone fishing? Fishing is an hours-long process, right? I mean, it takes forever to catch a fish. And to catch one of that size is a rare occurrence. So there is no way that Robert Flaherty had his camera rolling when Nanook reeled in that fish. It's just not logical, not likely. So either what happened is Nanook was reeling in the fish and he got the camera to speed and he got it for real as he's pulling that fish out of the water. Or more likely what happened is Nanook caught the fish, killed it. They set up the camera, they set up whatever lighting they had. Maybe they were just using sun lighting and a reflector. They set everything up. They put the fish back in the dead fish back in the water, and they had Nanook reel it back out of the water. And I think if you look closely, you can see that it's already a dead fish. So that raises so many issues about truth, right? What is true and what's not true in this moment? Now, it's certainly true that if Nanook in real life does not catch a fish of this size while out on the hunt, that one of his children may die, right? Or he and his wife may starve to death. Nobody's going to eat that day if that fish is not caught. So that is absolutely documentary truth, that component of it. But the question is, obviously for the cynics in the room and for film students everywhere, was it faked and does it matter? And I would argue that yes, it was faked, but maybe it doesn't matter because there is some real truth captured in that moment. There are some other things in that film. For example, he catches a fox, they build an igloo, all kinds of things that are real archetypal events from Nanook's life that were, if not captured by Flaherty in this film, would not be available to us at all. We'd have no idea how the hunt worked, how the family had to go out together into the tundra. You couldn't leave the kids back because it may be 5 or 6 days of walking before you found that piece of food, that seal or whatever it is. So the kids had to be there with the family. And so when they build an igloo to sleep at night, you know that igloo had to be built every day because they weren't coming back to a place that they had already failed at, right? They were going forward day after day to find food. And so every day Nanook is building an igloo as a temporary shelter for his family while they are out on the hunt together. So 100%, if not for this film showing us that, we don't get that. I mean, this is rare footage. But, you know, I have questions like, how is it so well lit in the interior? Where's that light source coming from? And so again, the cynic says, okay, maybe for this shoot, Nanook built half an igloo, right? Maybe he built the back half of the igloo and they laid on the carpet and Flaherty brought his camera in and shot what a family would look like on the hunt in an igloo in, you know, north, like this is like Greenland, Canada, way north, Arctic Circle type stuff. So that's the question around documentary truth. What can we see is real? What can we see is fake? And then separate from that, does it matter? Does it matter? And I would argue that maybe not. Maybe it doesn't matter in this case because we have this amazing film document of how their life was probably really lived. And it's a wonderful film. It's such a good film because of that, because, you know, you're just not going to see that anywhere else. That was captured that one time, and those societies probably don't exist in any way at all anymore. If Nanook is alive today, he's driving a Ford F-150, and he's probably shopping at a grocery store, right? So, you know, 100 years later, 90 years later, that life that was captured is non-existent in so many ways on the planet. Okay, so those are the questions, and those are the questions that I would like you to be asking, not only of the films that we screen, but of your own work. How do you get at that element of truth? So if you're making a film about dreamers, right? What is their truth, right? What happened in their lives that the rest of the world just doesn't know about or doesn't see? How did they get here, right? How did they survive for, let's say your dreamer is 20 years old, and they were born here, obviously, but there were all these questions that they had to navigate growing up. So how do you present a story about that person that does have its fundamental truth and that shows that aspect of their life that the rest of us would not know about without your film? And so that's your mission for today, right? And that's your mission with your group, is to think about the topic. And it's probably the most important decision you're going to make today, I hope. What's your topic? How do you tell a story that's fundamentally valuable? And once you've found that fundamentally valuable story, how do you find the person to highlight, to tell the story about? Because remember, again, it's got to be fundamentally human. So let me move on with my PowerPoint. That's my my thinking regarding documentary truth, but I want to get into the PowerPoint, and I want to ask you. I'm going to stop the recording for a second, and I want to ask you if anybody the group work. So okay, so if you guys are watching this asynchronous, we just had a discussion about documentary truth and the news business and talking heads and how we all look at people who are on TV and question their credibility. I think all of us do it. And it's a quick Google search to see who this person is, what their agenda is, and are they believable? And that's the flip side of what we've been talking about so far, where we all want these stories to be true, but we always verify truth with verification. Okay, so I have two clips here, and I put both of these clips in the modules section of Elm. So we're not going to watch them today in the lecture, but I would ask you to go back and watch them in Elms. And I want to describe both of these. I've talked about First Kiss already, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. And my cynicism around, are these actors, are they models? I'll tell you one thing that I noticed. They're all very good looking. They're all in really great shape, and they all look like Brooklyn hipsters to me. So I was really skeptical about it when I saw it. And then especially the woman who became a star. But The Kiss is really interesting. And I got a screen grab of Thomas Edison's film, The Kiss. And Edison only gets credit because he owned the lab where the film camera was made. He didn't actually invent the film camera. One of his engineers did. And he didn't shoot or edit this film, but it's called Edison's The Kiss. So it's two people kissing on camera, probably the first time it had ever been shown on film, two people kissing. But, you know, they're not in love. They're actors. They were actors in a play on Broadway, and they don't look like actors, but they were actors in a play on Broadway. And this was the kiss that finished the play. So it was the romantic moment where they come together in the kiss. So yes, Edison's capturing something from real life, but he's capturing something from a performance that's not actually real life. So it's an interesting question around that little short film. And if you don't watch it, it's 15 seconds. They weren't making massively long films in those days. Anyway, so the word ontology is important here, and you can paraphrase ontology in this kind of loose definition is something, a description of something that is its truth. What is it in its essential form? So an ontological form is this thing distilled down to what it really is. And so if you're watching a news program with someone who is clearly lying, you could say ontologically it's manipulative, it's fake. You could describe it ways that you would say are a truthful representation of this. And so it's an important term in philosophy and in filmmaking, because we deal so much with what's true and what's captured and what's not real and what's manipulated. And now in the digital era, when everything can be manipulated, does ontology even exist anymore in media? Can we ever say this really happened? It's actually there, it's real, it's true, it's honest? And the answer is probably no in so many cases. I guess there are cases where you can say it's true. So ontology is an important word for you to learn, good SAT word. It'll definitely be on the GREs, and it's useful when framing filmmaking. Okay, another term that's worth discussing is the term gaze, G-A-Z-E, and it's the idea of looking, right? When we look at something, we are engaging in gaze, and there are all these questions around the power dynamics in looking. When you look at Pinterest, right, and you see someone's Pinterest list, their style board, that's a kind of gaze where we see all these different things that we wish we had, right? So someone who's got, say, one of those live-in minivans, you know, and they live at the beach in Australia, and they've got all these pictures on their social media of shooting out the van to this wide vista of an Australian beach. I get pretty jealous, right? I mean, that's a kind of gaze where, you know, I spend so much time in my library day after day after day, where there is this kind of looking that I do at that sort of social media posting, where I think, you know, how did I spend my life? Why did I make these choices instead of those choices? So that's really interesting how we posit ourselves vis-a-vis gaze with desire. So gaze is usually about desire. And it's a very famous construct. There's a film critic named Laura Mulvey. She's a professor at UCLA. And she was one of the first people to recognize that in classical Hollywood cinema, so cinema before the current era, the classical era, the black and white era, she recognized that the male character gazing at the female body in these older movies represented a power dynamic where the male gaze had power over the female body. It's a fascinating idea, and she discovered so much about, she opened up the era that we're in now in so many interesting ways. Now, certainly, that's only describing classical Hollywood cinema. And in her construct, both men and women in the audience look through the eyes of the male character at the female character, which is a fascinating moment in time. But now we can say that gaze theory has shifted, and you can see gaze happening across all genders, all sexualities, male, female, young, old. You can see the construction of these dynamics in Instagram, Pinterest, social media, filmmaking. It's everywhere. And it really is a sort of defining idea of our era. So if you guys are interested in this theoretically, I would say read into it, because it's a fascinating moment in cultural criticism. And it opened up so much. And now you've got hundreds of critics that have responded to her original thinking about power in looking. And the last question I would have before I get out of this slide is, where is the power? Is the power in looking now, or is it in creating the Instagram post that 1 million people look at? And I can say that in some ways, Instagram and social media has flipped that dynamic. So whereas Laura Mulvey described a power dynamic that was on screen, I think now we're seeing something that's a little bit different and pretty fascinating theoretically in the digital era. So something for you guys that are interested in theory to think about. If you want to look, I have not put this on a pod, but there's an Undress Me video that's really fascinating. You can find it on YouTube. And what's so compelling about this is it's all these people in really intimate situations. If we were in class together, I would show it to you. But it turns out it's a soap commercial, right? It's all these people in these really intimate situations. It looks like it's this like great relationship thing, and it turns out at the end that it's all part of a viral campaign. So even this stuff, our most private, personal moments now are part of this this looking era. We're in the era of looking in so many ways. Two more types of gaze, and these are all described in your textbooks. You guys will read this for sure in the text leading up to some of the early quizzes. There is the helpless gaze, and this shot is taken right from the textbook. I mean, the context. I pulled the shot off the internet, but the context is taken right from the textbook, where it talks about looking at a police beating and feeling helpless. Like, you know, the person holding the camera can't do anything. Rodney King here being beaten, can't stop it. So this expression of helplessness is really, it's really contemporary and it's really moving. Now this video itself, as you guys can see, is from almost 30 years ago. Almost 30 years ago, the Rodney King beating happened in Los Angeles. And the book does an interesting job of explaining the helpless gaze, where we look at something and we just can't fix it. I think that's a defining term in contemporary culture for sure, even though, again, it's 30 years old. And then the last part of the gaze that I want to talk about is the endangered gaze, where the person holding the camera or making the image is putting themselves into a dangerous place. So think about Steve Irwin being killed while taping a show. And in the case here of Tim Hetherington, he made this film Restrepo documentary. It won Sundance, and if I remember correctly, it won an Academy Award also. And then he was in Syria and he was murdered, right? He had made films about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and got all this acclaim because he was putting himself in harm's way. And then when he got to Syria, it proved to be foreshadowing, and he was killed while making a film in Syria. So that's it for talking about gaze. And all I would ask is that you use theory as a way of framing the thinking you're doing about your own work. So I'm going to pause the recording now,